Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and every system you depend on to survive. The grocery store 3 blocks away, the water treatment plant running silently beneath your city, the power grid humming through your walls, the bank holding your purchasing power, the internet carrying your communications, has been completely severed, not temporarily, not gradually, but all at once and permanently for the next 7 months. And yet, you are not alone in this condition. You are surrounded by 5,000 other people, all of them alive, all of them working, all of them eating 3 meals a day, receiving medical care, sleeping in assigned quarters, following a schedule that is not broken down. And here's the question that should stop you before you move on. How does an economy function when money does not exist inside it? When no transaction is ever made? When no price is ever set? When no market ever clears? When 5,000 people receive everything they need through a system so precisely engineered that scarcity is not solved by wealth but by design, and the answer lives aboard a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, a floating structure longer than 3 football fields, displacing over 100,000 tons of seawater, running continuously for months in waters that have no interest in whether anyone aboard survives, and what it represents is not a warship in the conventional sense. It is the most complete working model of a non-monetary urban economy ever constructed by human civilization. A city that does not use money, has never needed money, and was specifically designed so that money could never become a dependency. Because in the middle of the ocean, 700 miles from the nearest port, inside an electromagnetic blackout, under operational silence, with no resupply vessel on the horizon, money cannot purchase a single additional liter of drinking water. It cannot accelerate the repair of a fractured steam pipe. It cannot move 5,000 people from starvation to satiation, and what fills that gap is not charity, not ideology, not improvisation. It is engineering, and understanding how that engineering works means starting not with the weapons, not with the aircraft, not with the command hierarchy, but with the most fundamental economic question any closed system must answer. What do people need to survive? And how do you deliver it without price signals, without currency, without a market? Start with water, because water is where every closed system either holds or fractures. And aboard a carrier operating far from shore, no external water supply exists, which means the ship must manufacture its own, continuously, from the only resource available in infinite quantity, the ocean surrounding it. And the system that accomplishes this is a series of evaporators and reverse osmosis plants embedded deep within the hull, drawing seawater inward, stripping its salinity through thermal and mechanical processes, and producing potable water at a rate calibrated not to abundance but to survival margin, which means the daily output is calculated against daily demand, with a buffer thin enough that if 2 of the primary desalination units fail simultaneously, rationing begins within hours, not days. And if you were living inside that system, if your shift ended and you walked to the nearest water station and found reduced pressure, reduced availability, you would immediately understand something that civilians almost never confront. Water is not a commodity you purchase, it is a flow rate you are allocated, and when that flow rate drops, the hierarchy of need activates with a precision that no monetary system could replicate in real time. Because there is no price signal to communicate scarcity, instead the allocation shifts automatically. Cooking operations receive priority, drinking stations maintain minimum flow, sanitation is reduced to function-critical levels, and 5,000 people adapt simultaneously because the system was engineered to force adaptation rather than rely on individual decision-making. And this is where civilian logic begins to collapse, because in a city with money, water scarcity produces price increases which theoretically incentivize conservation, but that process is slow, it is uneven, it is mediated by purchasing power, it produces inequity, it requires time to signal and time to respond, and time is precisely what a closed system under operational pressure does not have. So the carrier solves the allocation problem not through price but through architecture. The pipes go where the hierarchy dictates, the valves close in a predetermined sequence, the people inside receive exactly what engineering determined they needed before the voyage began, and the extraordinary result is that 5,000 people living without any monetary mechanism for resource allocation are actually more precisely supplied with water than most cities on Earth, not because they are more virtuous, but because the system was designed for a single constraint: survival without resupply. Here is what most people never consider. Food aboard a carrier is not purchased by anyone, not by the sailors, not by the officers, not by any individual inside the hull. Yet it is one of the most logistically complex supply operations in existence, because feeding 5,000 people 3 full meals a day for 7 months requires storing, preserving, and cycling through millions of pounds of provisions loaded before departure, and the system governing that process is not a cafeteria economy. It is a caloric logistics matrix, where every item stored in the ship's freezers, dry goods compartments, and refrigerated holds has been calculated against consumption rates, mission duration, caloric requirements by role, and waste margins, with the result that the galley, the carrier's food production system, operates on something closer to a central allocation model than anything resembling a market, where demand is known in advance, supply is fixed at departure, and the distribution system delivers meals not based on ability to pay, but based on schedule and station. And if you were here, if you lined up at the mess decks at 0600 after a 12-hour night shift maintaining aircraft systems, the meal you received would cost you nothing, require no transaction, produce no receipt, and yet it would be nutritionally calibrated, portion-controlled, and delivered with enough regularity that your body clock would synchronize to it. And this matters psychologically in ways that monetary food systems never produce. Because when food arrives on schedule, regardless of individual economic condition, it removes an entire category of anxiety from 5,000 minds simultaneously. The anxiety of affordability, the anxiety of access, the anxiety of adequacy, and what replaces it is something more cognitively demanding but more stabilizing. The expectation of system reliability, and when that reliability fractures, when a refrigeration unit fails and a portion of the protein supply is compromised, the response is not a price spike. It is a menu recalculation performed within hours by the supply officer, a redistribution of preserved alternatives, a reduction in protein-heavy meals replaced by caloric equivalents from dry stores, and 5,000 people eat a slightly different meal that day, without negotiation, without complaint escalation, without market adjustment. Because the system absorbed the shock and redistributed the output, and this is the architecture of a non-monetary economy functioning under real constraint. But this creates a new vulnerability, and it lives not in the supply chains or the water systems, but in the human layer. Because 5,000 people living in a closed environment without monetary exchange, without the freedom of consumer choice, without the ability to signal preference through purchasing decisions, without the psychological comfort of economic agency, are living inside a social contract that must be maintained entirely through institutional authority and systemic trust. And if that trust degrades, if the allocation system is perceived as unfair, if the hierarchy of distribution begins to feel arbitrary rather than engineered, the psychological coherence of the population begins to fracture in ways that no physical system can repair. Which is why the non-monetary economy of a carrier is inseparable from its command structure. Because the command structure is the mechanism through which the allocation decisions are legitimized, every resource distribution aboard the ship flows through a chain of authority that is itself a kind of non-monetary pricing system, where the currency is not dollars, but rank, function, and mission criticality. And the pilots who fly the aircraft receive their resources not because they can afford them, but because their function sits at the top of the operational priority hierarchy, and the deck crews who service those aircraft receive theirs because without their function, the pilots cannot fly, and the food service workers who operate the galley receive theirs because without their function, 5,000 people begin to deteriorate within days. And the result is a resource allocation model that looks nothing like a market, but produces something a market also attempts to produce. A working division of labor sustained by incentive. Only the incentive here is not profit. It is survival continuity. And what keeps 5,000 people inside that system without rebellion, without defection, without the slow erosion of compliance that undermines every centrally planned economy in history, is a factor that civilian economists almost never model. The inescapability of the environment, because you cannot exit a carrier mid-ocean, you cannot shop elsewhere, you cannot withdraw your labor and survive independently, and the ocean enforces a compliance that no political system has ever reliably achieved on land, which means the carrier is not a utopia of non-monetary distribution, it is a constraint-forced model where the absence of alternatives makes the system work. And understanding this is essential to understanding why it cannot simply be copied, why the economic model of the carrier is not an ideology, but an engineering response to a specific and extreme set of physical constraints. And this is where the pressure intensifies, because the deepest layer of the carrier's non-monetary economy is not food or water or even fuel, it is power. And power aboard a nuclear carrier is the one resource that governs all other resources. That enables the desalination system to run, that keeps the refrigeration units cold, that moves the catapults, that maintains the lighting in the sleeping quarters where exhausted crew members rotate through 6-hour rest cycles in bunks stacked 3 high in compartments smaller than most urban apartments, that runs the medical bay where surgeries are performed 700 miles from the nearest hospital. That sustains the communication systems through which the command structure maintains its authority, and the nuclear reactors at the heart of a Nimitz-class carrier produce this power continuously without refueling for over 20 years, which means that in the deepest sense, the carrier's non-monetary economy runs on a power source that itself operates outside any economic model, that cannot be purchased incrementally, that cannot be rationed in the way water or food can be rationed, because the reactor either runs at the tolerances it was designed to maintain or it doesn't run at all, and the people who maintain those reactors, the nuclear-trained engineers who work in the most regulated and monitored environment aboard the ship, operate inside the tightest constraint the entire system imposes, because a reactor casualty at sea does not produce an economic problem. It produces an existential one, and if you were stationed in that space, if you understood that your shift existed not to generate profit or produce a measurable output in any commercial sense, but to maintain the continuous physical conditions under which 5,000 people remained alive and mobile in hostile waters, you would understand something about non-monetary labor that no job description can convey. That some work is not compensated, because compensation is not the mechanism through which it is motivated. It is motivated by the understanding that the alternative to doing it correctly is a failure cascade that no amount of money could reverse. Here is what the carrier ultimately represents. When you remove the aircraft and set aside the operational mission and look only at the infrastructure, only at the systems, only at the designed relationships between 5,000 human beings and the resources they require to survive. It is the most rigorously tested model of post-monetary urban infrastructure ever operated continuously at scale. A city that resolved the allocation problem not through price, but through engineering, not through markets, but through hierarchy and constraint. It not through individual economic agency, but through collective dependence on systems too large and too critical for any individual to own or manipulate. And the design philosophy that produced it is not political. It is physical. It emerged from the recognition that at sufficient distance from resupply, in sufficient operational isolation, under sufficient pressure, money becomes inert. It cannot be exchanged for anything that matters, because nothing that matters is available for exchange. And what replaces it is the architecture of necessity, and what sustains that architecture is not ideology but the ocean, cold and indifferent, enforcing a compliance that no economist ever modeled and no government ever achieved, and 5,000 people wake up every morning inside that system, eat their allocated meal, perform their assigned function, sleep in their assigned bunk, and the city runs, and the question that the carrier leaves unanswered. The system it contains that has never been fully mapped in public documentation is the psychological infrastructure, The internal mechanisms through which 5,000 people maintain the mental coherence to sustain this model for 7 months, without the psychological anchors that monetary economies provide, without the sense of agency that spending and choosing and acquiring produces, and how that coherence is engineered, how it is monitored, how it is maintained when it begins to fracture, and what happens when it doesn't hold. That is a system we have not opened yet.